And as I mentioned early on, this webinar is hosted by the HERDSA Assessment Quality Special Interest Group. And both Simon and myself lead this special interest group. We have a Facebook group, about 132 members, or maybe one or two more in the last day or two, etc. And that is actually our primary way in which we communicate with our members. If you'd like to join the special interest group, you can either scan the QR code or just search for it on Facebook, please. And that brings us to today's topic, which is on assessment for inclusion. And the image that I've got on top over here is probably represents what we talk about when we talk about inclusion quite well. It's not about an equal, everybody getting exactly the same thing. It's about making it easier for everybody to engage in in higher education as effectively as they can. So we're really excited to have Joe joining us as well. Was it last year or the year before last? Joe led a national project on inclusion, assessment for inclusion, and they've done a lot of work in that space as well. So we're quite excited to have Joe joining us as well. Joe is a senior research fellow at the Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. And on that note, I'll stop sharing, Joe, and welcome you to take over.
Thanks, Praneeth. And yeah, it's great to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. My talk today, and some of you might have seen my efforts at self-promotion on LinkedIn and on Twitter. I first gave this talk last week. It feels like a long time ago now, but just last week in Dublin for QQI, which is their quality and qualifications sort of body, similar to TEXA here. And it was lovely to be there in like a physical room full of people all interested on the same topic. And I think similarly today, it's lovely to be here in a virtual room with people who are interested enough to hear what I say and to spend this hour on what's kind of like this odd sort of Friday after a public holiday. So thanks for coming and making the time to come today. So yeah, are we all heading in the same direction? I would also like to acknowledge firstly the traditional owners of the lands on which I am at the moment and on the lands on which I live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And that there is a sculpture of Bunjil, the eagle, the creator spirit, and hopefully is a symbol of guiding us, and also to remember that education has been happening and learning has been happening here for thousands and thousands of years in an inclusive manner. So hopefully we can move towards more of that ourselves. I'd also like to acknowledge colleagues, both current and former, at Cradle, because the work that I'm presenting today is not just work that I've done by myself. And I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of participants in the research projects that I've done, the workshops that I've held, so students, academics, accessibility practitioners, and others, all of whom have informed what I'm talking about today. So the talk is kind of in three parts. Firstly, the present day situation. Then I'll talk a little bit more about what we could aim for in assessment for inclusion. And then I'll spend some time talking about how we might get there and the things we can do. So this is the one bit of audience participation. I'm going to read out this quote and then I'm going to ask you to think about when it might have been written. And this quote is, "Higher education assessment is changing because the needs of higher education are changing. These needs are changing because technology is dramatically transforming not only modes of assessment, but also modes of learning and problem solving. The overarching concerns for equity in higher education and fairness in assessment become paramount in this era of societal flux, especially as they intersect with issues of access, equality, diversity, and accountability in higher education." So for those of you who are here in the room today, you can pop something in the chat if you like, or you can shout it out. When do you think this quote was written and published? 1990, 2021. Yeah, Sally suggests, Sally has picked up on the framing of the question, suggests about 20 years ago. Sharon's got 70s, yeah, 80s, the whole frame, the whole lot. A long time ago, 1900, okay, that would be amazing. It was 1998. So well done to those people who are kind of like between 1990s and 2000s. Yeah, Ben, I think you and Jody probably and Andrea are the closest. So props to you. And this is to indicate that concerns around equity in education have been in the minds of at least some people for a long time. And I was still in primary school when this quote was when this thing was written, and I'm sure that there are similar things echoed previously back to probably the 1900s as well about how we think about access, equality, how we think about diversity in higher education. So it does pay for us to think about what's been done in the past and perhaps, what can we learn from the past, as well as how can we get to new places that perhaps aren't the same as the ones that we're stuck in. Because if that was what happened, almost 25 years ago, has anything really changed? And if so, why not? What can we do differently? So I'd first like to take you back to probably what's a very cradle way of thinking about assessment, that it has multiple purposes, that it's not just assessment of learning in that certification that ensures learning outcomes are met, although that is still a very important part of assessment. We're also thinking about how assessment contributes to learning, develops student capabilities, supports them to actually complete tasks. And the perhaps slightly newer idea, or an idea that's been around for a while, but we're still trying to promote a little bit more, is about assessment as learning, that idea of sustainability, that students learn something through doing the assessment and it prepares them beyond the current task. So they're not limited by the constraints of the task, and they are ready to move into a future where they don't have assessments or teachers to tell them whether they did things right or not. So there are these multiple purposes, and they sometimes can be in tension, but the fact is assessment is incredibly influential on what students do. And David Bowd, who is my boss, wrote again a while ago, students can with difficulty escape from the effects of poor teaching. They cannot, by definition, if they want to graduate, escape the effects of poor assessment. So that impact of assessment can also be talked about in the terms of, as Biggs says, the backwash effect, those unintended things that happen as a result of assessment, what we prompt students to do as a result of setting up an assessment task in a particular way. And of course, not all of these things are the ones that we expect to happen. So would like to then remind everybody about these obligations in assessment. And these are things that exist whether we like it or not. There are legal requirements. Now, there's the Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education, which kind of sit beyond the higher education sector. And they do say that we have to offer opportunities for students or people to become students and to participate in education. The higher education standards framework, the threshold standards, also actually say that we have to offer inclusive opportunities, not just for learning, but also for assessment, to ensure that everyone can demonstrate their capabilities. And I was kind of, for the past couple of years, I've always been framing my arguments around that Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education. I didn't think even to go to the Higher Education Standards Framework, but it's there. So these are things that we have to do. We have to be able to support students, diverse students, to participate in assessment, so that they can demonstrate their capabilities. And there are also the ethical and moral obligations around assessment. The opportunity costs of study and failure is something that one of my now ex-colleagues, Rola Ajawi, has written a bit about, in the sense that students are quite persistent, but when they are faced with failure, they do have to make decisions about what they do next. And if assessment isn't getting it right around supporting diversity, around being designed in a way that does support inclusion, then there are significant potentially life-changing impacts for those students. And Jan MacArthur also says that, you know, it's more than just making sure that students get the right mark in assessment. We have to be thinking about their experiences, about what they want to do with the education they're participating in, and where they're going to go beyond higher education, and how they also might make a change in the world. And therefore, what we do in assessment is really meaningful from that perspective. So why should we be concerned about inclusion? Perhaps, you know, you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm doing a good job. I've got this under control. I do reasonable adjustments. You know, I'm that kind of, you know, I do things by the book. But we know that reasonable adjustments don't actually meet diverse student needs. And we've known this for quite some time. So Waterfield and West in 2006 surveyed a number of students, and they found that while 60% of students who needed special arrangements were satisfied with them, there were 18% that were not, and 14% who were ambivalent, and that was kind of like I'm not sure if they do satisfy my needs. So, you know, this is about 30%, so a third of students who get reasonable adjustments are saying they're not actually doing the right thing for me, like they don't actually help me do any better. And more recently, some colleagues did a bit of an experiment. They offered students with ADHD and other learning disabilities a separate room for exams, and they found that actually it didn't actually result in better performance. So the accommodations and the adjustments that we have available to us don't actually work for the problems that students face. And that's just for the students who actually say, yes, I am different and I need something. There are a whole bunch of students out there who don't want to declare that they are different. And Susan Grimes did a series of studies looking at this hidden population of students, and she found that this was a survey of over 2,000 students. Of those with a diagnosis, almost 50% didn't actually disclose their condition, despite saying, yes, my condition does have an impact on how I learn at university. So what that means is that we can't even offer accommodations which don't really work to people that we don't know about. So there are people out there who are just undertaking assessment and probably not doing as well as they could have, because we don't know that they could be supported in a different way to demonstrate what they can actually do. And I've been talking mainly in terms of disability so far, but that's just one lens and one frame and one group or label that we can think about when we're thinking about student diversity. The big blue dashed line is that students with a disability, and the number of students has been increasing over time. We can also see a bunch of other lines on the graph, which are all also increasing, and they are other equity groups that we do have statistics for, like students from a non-English speaking background, women in a non-traditional area, low socioeconomic students, students from remote and regional areas, and Indigenous students. So they're just the categories that the government has decided to collect data on. And we might also think about diversity beyond just those background characteristics. There might be other things that you know creates diversity in your cohort of students. And we might also think about students' learning goals and interests and what they're doing in their degree and where they might think they're going beyond education, and think about that also flavouring what students are interested in, what capabilities they think they need to develop for their future lives. So, is assessment an inclusive experience? Say probably not for everyone and not all the time. So I think Pranit mention that we did have a grant from NESHE to look at students' experiences and to try and reimagine what would happen around exams and high stakes tasks. And so we asked them, what made it inclusive and what didn't make it inclusive. And the things that were important for inclusion were positive relationships with faculty and support staff. And that really made them feel like they were being included and they belonged, and this was a supportive environment. And we did this research during COVID, so they found that technology was helpful, but not always. So there was a lot of change to remote exams. And in this framing, internet and connection speed was sometimes helpful, but sometimes it really prevented them from demonstrating their capabilities. Screen readers were incompatible with some exam platforms, and similarly with sort of like spelling and grammar supports that, say, dyslexic students would usually use were not necessarily always able to be used with particular platforms, and that was problematic. Students also commented a lot about the spaces and timing of things like exams when they had a physical disability, about making sure that they could actually get to the venue, finding out where the nearest lift or ramp was and where the bathroom was in relation to everything else. This was also important for when students needed support to get to an exam location. And in one instance, the student had a partner who also had a form of disability, and they said, look, it's problematic if I have to turn up an hour early just to get my special consideration accommodations, just to make sure that they're actually there. My partner has to wait for a long time, and that's really exhausting for them because they also have a condition. And so, as soon as we started asking about these things, we found out more and more about stuff that we hadn't really thought about initially that actually is a little less inclusive. The assessment task design also had some implications for inclusion. So for those with fatigue as part of their medical condition, but also for those with learning differences. And so things like memory recall was difficult for some people, but other people also said that, multiple choice questions were actually quite helpful for their anxiety because they knew that the answer would be one of these things, which was less daunting than, say, an open-ended task. And as I sort of indicated earlier, these aren't new problems. That's Messick's book from 1998 on assessment in higher education, issues of access equality. Mike Adams and Sally Brown published a book around inclusive learning in higher education in 2006. And Cheryl Bergstaller published the second edition of a book on universal design in higher education, which does have a specific chapter around assessment in it, in 2015. So these conversations around equity have been going on for quite some time. But things, it feels like, and I was surprised actually, because I only found that 1998 book recently. I was surprised that, we're still kind of saying the same things. And this kind of led us at Cradle to think about, well, what can we do to change the conversation a little bit more? Can we push things along a little bit further? And we came to this like rephrasing to think about assessment for inclusion rather than thinking about it as inclusive assessment. And one of the things that Geraldine O'Neill said last week when I was in Dublin is, the phrase inclusive assessment implies it could be inclusive or not inclusive. There's no in between there, which is difficult and problematic when there's probably always more to be done on the front of inclusion, and it really draws that hard line in the sand. And she said, we've also gone with this framing, assessment for inclusion, because it leaves you the room to the goal, the aspiration to be there, but you can do things along the way. And I think the other contribution that we've made in the paper from Cradle is that we've flipped it from thinking about specifically about students to thinking about the assessment design. And so our definition is assessment should recognize diversity in student learning an endeavour to ensure that no student is discriminated against by virtue of features other than their ability to meet appropriate standards. So we've actually made it a problem around the assessment design rather than a problem of students. And in case you haven't figured it out, I'm trying to suggest here that in alignment with Molly, who wrote about this in the context of employability, that the medical model of disability is flawed, right? And that's where it really is seeing the disability as a problem of the individual. Instead, we need to recognise the biopsychosocial factors around an individual which contribute to their disadvantage in higher education. And Molly even goes so far as to say that reasonable adjustments are ableist because they try and expect everyone to come up to this particular way of doing things the same as everybody else. Whereas we should be thinking about how to support people in their diversity to demonstrate capability in a way that is appropriate and meaningful for them and where they're going in their lives. Jan MacArthur also talks about this in the sort of bigger frame of social justice, suggesting that currently the way that we think about inclusion in assessment focuses on those procedural aspects of fairness. So did everyone go through the same set of processes in the assessment task? This means that we tend to ignore those underlying constructs of what the assessment task actually is. Are we assessing the appropriate things, or are we assessing things irrelevant to those learning outcomes that we hope students are achieving? And finally, she also talks about that the lived experience and outcomes of students are ignored in this framing. We don't actually think about how students are going through this process. And yeah, it's through a number of studies, it's become clear to me how fraught this area is. And here at Deakin, as similar to a lot of other institutions, we do have access plans, and they do also contribute to the student experience. And I analysed 2,860 of them a few years ago, and this was sort of pre-pandemic almost times, and I understand since then the number of learning access plans has increased. Basically, these plans made up just 4.7% of the total student population. This is less than the number of people who ticked the box on the form at the start of university saying, yes, I have some kind of disability or other condition. And it's less than the number of people in the general population, according to the ABS, who may have some form of disability, which all goes to say that learning access plans aren't actually tackling all the problems to do with assessment. And when we looked at what was happening in those access plans, exams was 71% of students with access plans. So they were the things that were really problematic. Online tests, group work, in-class participation and oral presentations were a little bit less problematic. But trying to keep on doing it from a perspective of we'll just change it for this student doesn't work when the scale increases, and is a lot of work for the Access Centre, in our case the Disability Resource Centre, when they have a broader remit to support people across the whole learning experience. So what can we do about it? I'm suggesting that there's perhaps 3 levels at which we can tackle this. Firstly, right at that student experience, then through assessment and course design, and also at the leadership and policy level. So what can we do? What do students say are important to them? Well, Molly and I led this study where we worked with students, diverse students, and asked them, what should teachers consider when designing or implementing inclusive assessment? And they said things like be passionate in what they do and be interested in having a real dialogue with students, to have relatable assignments that students can connect to avoid making the assignment too narrow so students can't put any of their own views into it, and have them more applicable to our future careers. So allow more realistic assignments, which are things we would expect to do in our jobs. And you might see in this that there are echoes with my suggestion that we should be thinking about diversity beyond just, particular student characteristics and perhaps equity group labels, but actually to be thinking about where students are going and what they want to do. Right, and so then we can think about assessment being more than just the task. And this is perhaps a little bit more powerful when we think about the things that we can do immediately to support students in their experiences. Here I've got the assessment design decisions design wheel, I suppose you could call it, which Margaret Bierman, Phil Dawson and others created now, like 10 years ago. And they've sort of divided assessment up into 6 sort of design features. So firstly, around the interactions. And so we can think about how students interact not only with academic staff, but also peers and student support services in what happens in assessment and how that could be made more inclusive. We can think about learner outcomes and how to design for diverse learner futures. In terms of tasks, firstly, the instructions and information need to be clear and consistent, and that was something that students really brought up around conflicting information, and this is problematic for all students, not just perhaps what we consider diversity, although I know Sally and others point out that when you add up all the diverse characteristics of students, probably 50% of students might be considered diverse. And also the timing of tasks. So one thing that students pointed out to us was to be inclusive for, say, students who have a job or caring responsibilities, that a 12 p.m. submission deadline is probably not very inclusive, because it means that some students would have to submit, say, the day before if they had rostered work, for instance, and they would lose time to spend on that assessment in comparison to other students. So I know one thing that Deakin has done has made the submission time 8 p.m, but there's no late penalty, so students can fix things or submit up until midnight that night and they won't receive a penalty, so penalties start the next day. Still not perfect, but it's one way to try and sort of be explicit about expectations about when things are submitted. And I know in the NESHE study, students were also highlighting that, if you do have a timed task or a limited release sort of take-home exam, that some students had the resources to be able to spend. They could, stay up all night, spend the whole 24 hours on this task, whereas other people had medical conditions or other obligations, which meant that they couldn't actually spend the whole 24 hours on the task, and they were trying to figure out, how much time should we spend on it? Should we wreck ourselves because we know that other people have the capability to do that? We can also think about the purposes of the assessment task in terms of being inclusive. Think about the student learning goals and the location of the task within the course. So is it necessary to assess all these things at this point? Can we be more supportive and in the way that we introduce the assessment, because it's a first year unit versus we expect students to be able to do everything perfectly because they're going to graduate next week. We can also think about the context of the task. And students really highlighted that assessment generated a lot of emotions for them, and a lot of these emotions were around anxiety and stress and fear. So think about how that can be mitigated, and think about how we situate the assessment task in context. We can also think about context is the resources around the assessment task as well. And say, do students have a think about what we require students to access in order to complete the task? Do they have access to the computer lab with the shiny computers who can actually make a good podcast or video? Or, is there a particular textbook that we're requiring people to read that is only available in person? Finally, we can think about feedback processes, and students really talked about these opportunities for learning as being a possibility for inclusion and being more inclusive. Okay, so moving a little bit more towards the assessment and course design for inclusion, we've suggested that it's an ongoing process, right? We don't just design the assessment and stop there. We're always thinking about how how the next cohort has gone, what can we tweak, what can we change, who's involved, acknowledging that there are multiple stakeholders at different levels. So thinking about the task design, the conditions of the task, how students interact with each other, and policy as well. And we can also, so we can therefore think about maybe 3 sort of bigger ideas for inclusive assessment design that might help frame the specifics of what we do in any particular situation. And they are authenticity in assessment, programmatic assessment, and assessment for distinctiveness. And these are things that are explicitly talked about in our paper. And this is just the mere summary. So firstly, thinking about authenticity being something that we can't actually fully control. And Peter Goodyear talks about the design time versus the learn time. And this is highly important when we're thinking about authenticity. So what we think is authentic might not actually be authentic to different types of students because of their experience. And so we might be it might be helpful to expand our framing of authenticity to thinking about how it involves selves. So how does an assessment integrate students' values, capabilities, and future aspirations? We can then think about the authenticity of the task, which is perhaps the traditional framing of authenticity. So, and beyond just the, does it look like a real work task? We can also think about the expectations about acceptable support or restrictions. One student who was a law student said to me in an interview, well, in a real life situation, and I'm hoping to become a lawyer, I don't think I'd ever be asked to prepare a brief for a client in 2 hours with no resources and handwritten. I'd have a computer, I'd be able to type things out, I'd be able to look things up. And so that alignment with future potential work is something that students were happy to work towards and happy to develop their capabilities in because they saw it as something that would be beneficial to them. And finally, authenticity in our values. So by involving diverse students in assessment design, we also demonstrate authenticity and inclusion through that potential mechanism. And so the picture here on the right is one of 2 bridges, and the message here is that there may be more than one way to have that bridge of authenticity from what we do here in education to the world beyond. So you might be on the railway bridge, which is really high up, or you might be walking across the footbridge. The next thing is to think about assessment at that program level. And colleagues here at Deakin talk about course-wide assessment rather than program level, because acknowledging that sometimes programs contain, some programs are more tightly determined and framed, and other programs allow students to pick and choose a little bit more. But regardless of that, this is a suggestion that not everything has to be assessed at every occasion. That while we might require students by the end of their degree to have appropriate written communication skills and appropriate oral communication skills and whole lot of disciplinary skills and disciplinary knowledge, that we don't have to slam them with everything at every single time. So this requires us to consider how tasks are linked or related, and also helps us to think about how we might scaffold students' capabilities over time, rather than expecting everyone to come in with a set of capabilities that they just use throughout the course. The last thing on the assessment design front is thinking about assessment for distinctiveness. And we don't want cookie cutter graduates, and I don't think we are getting cookie cutter graduates, right? Because they are all going to unique destinations. And I've only mentioned work a few times here because, the purposes of education are beyond just getting a job. So we need to support students to develop in the ways that they see are appropriate and that they want to develop, so that they can do whatever it is that they are going to. So open-ended tasks are really part of this direction towards inclusion. And offering a variety of ways to demonstrate learning also aligns with UDL, which is something that I haven't really talked about, but is another way of thinking about, well, how can we do things differently to be inclusive? So then coming to that final level, to the leadership and policy for inclusion. And we have discovered throughout our work that there are perceived conflicts with upholding academic standards, concerns about academic integrity, and meeting industry accreditation requirements. But for every time someone said something, oh, this is problematic, we've actually found that there are benefits in terms of inclusion. So in terms of upholding academic standards, you get a richer conversation about what is it that we should be expecting from our students. In terms of academic integrity, well, a lot of the ways that we think were traditionally secure ways to assess students, it turns out aren't. So it's just as easy to cheat an exam as it is anything else these days. And that's been, there's a bit of evidence out there from colleagues who do more work in the cheating space. And finally, on the accreditation front, in some discussions, we found that actually accreditation bodies would be happy to have assessments that are, a little bit more aligned to support more refined outcomes for graduates and to actually support that. And in our research of actually looking at the accreditation documents, we're like, well, it doesn't actually say anywhere that you have to, in the instance of nursing, that's nurses have to be able to do this one particular physical task. The accreditation requirements exist at a bit of a higher level than that. And so, we can be creative about how we support students to meet those requirements. And on the right here, I've got a little graph from a workshop I did earlier this year within health professions assessment. And I asked, does your institution have a policy on inclusion in assessment? 9 said yes, 6 said no, and 2 said don't know. And while we might think that policy is something that we don't really have an opportunity to change, it turns out that policy gets reviewed all the time. And down the bottom here in the screenshot, I've just got a screenshot of the Deakin assessment procedure, which is what sits below the policy. And it says, assessment design is inclusive and reflects the diversity of communities that Deakin serves. And what happened here was, we started conversations or the research projects in 2020 and 2021. It was really building momentum. I went away on maternity leave in 2022, not having heard very much about policy stuff going on. And when I came back, turned out that it had changed to be inclusive. So I wasn't even around and it just happened like that. So from that perspective, things can change. And once it's in the procedure, then people kind of go, well, I guess we've got to work towards what it says. And students also might say, well, it's in the procedure, why aren't you doing it? So I think it's really great that things can change. So a little word on feedback for inclusion before I wind up. And this is something that we haven't really spent much time thinking about so far, but feedback has been something that students have talked about as the potential for being more inclusive. And when I think about the ideas that have been promoted by Cradle and colleagues, maybe for the past 10 years now, thinking about feedback as an active process involving students and others to promote students' capabilities to engage in feedback, so developing their student feedback literacy, and to recognise the possibilities of different modes and processes for feedback to offer better quality and more accessible feedback. I think that these are all things that are taking us in the direction of being more inclusive when we're thinking about feedback, as opposed to the old ways, which is sort of modelled in this comic where an old white dude with no hair sort of fires off a cannon of feedback towards some students and says, yeah, I think I did a good job. So being responsive to our students and really inviting them to be part of that process and inviting them and supporting them to be active participants and to declare what it is that they want out of a feedback conversation is perhaps one of the first steps towards inclusion. So what do we do and how can we do it? I think this is, we're in a space where there's a lot of conversations around inclusion and equity now, which is great. And we could be thinking about our practice and the nexus between practice and research. So what we could be thinking about what happens tomorrow, maybe what we do for next semester in a year's time and further down the track. There's so many opportunities. And we could be thinking about what we do ourselves in our interactions with students and our staff, with our teams. We could be thinking about, what's the conversation going on at our institution, at a sector, or, what links do I have internationally? And we could also be targeting different people. We could be thinking about what matters most for students. How could we change conversations with academics, with the systems that we work in, across industries and accreditation bodies? And I've never been in a situation where, further research hasn't been needed. But here are a few things. We do need to keep on looking at diverse students' experiences of assessment and to look at this in detail. We need to consider how technology can make a difference, positive or negative. We can also take that perspective of validity of assessment designs, and also think about, what are the actual outcomes? What is the impact of doing things differently on student success, on what students actually do, or whether they can, whether it's actually made a difference for them. And now the question about how can we head in the same direction? Because it is possible, and I have heard, that things that support one group of people don't necessarily also support other groups of people. And that, if we're working individually, that we might replicate efforts. And that was something that I heard also this morning in the HERDSA Vic session around Indigenous knowledges in higher education, that, we've got to stop and make sure that we're actually not replicating efforts and to work together instead. So firstly, we should collaborate. We should agree on that destination. We should value the diversity that multiple people bring and recognize that there may be multiple routes to get to the same aspirations. And we also need to stop and pause and monitor our progress and figure out if things are working at cross purposes, because that just makes everyone grumpy. So if I had something for you to take away, I mean, there's lots of things, but firstly, assessment for inclusion is a perpetual endeavour requiring robust conversation. So some of the things we're going to talk about are, really, I think, sometimes really make people take pause and think about their own situations perhaps. And sometimes when we're talking about assessment, it really questions, disciplinary sort of traditions around the way that assessment has always been done. So it can sometimes be a little bit sort of emotional, and perhaps we need to be prepared for that. But supporting inclusion is a worthy goal. Any problems with assessment, and particularly poor assessment, are amplified for diverse students. So it is problematic, full stop, and more problematic for diverse students. We do need to shift away from that deficit discourse to consider how students can demonstrate capabilities in different ways. And this is important for validity as well as inclusion. If the assessment task excludes certain people and says they failed when actually they could have passed in a different way, then the assessment task is not doing its job. When we're designing assessment, it always involves compromise, and our choices are not neutral, so we need to consider the trade-offs when we're designing assessment. And finally, each of us can contribute to the aspiration of assessment for inclusion in different ways, wherever we are, at a personal level. If we're a tutor, if we're at senior management, there's a place for us to advocate for and to do things differently. So thanks very much for the opportunity to share this. And I will flip to the references list, which is pretty long. And also mention that Cradle does have a whole range of resources around assessment design, which you can get to via the URL or the QR code. And very happy to have some time for discussion, which I know I haven't left much time. Sorry, Praneet. But yeah, feel free to email me as well. So thanks, everyone.
That's all right. Look, thank you so much for that, Jo. It always is so refreshing to hear you because the perspective that you bring to these conversations is so well researched and so well supported and documented as well. Quite often when we talk about some offers, inclusive assessments, the passion takes over kind of thing. And then whilst there's necessarily nothing wrong with that, I think it's important to back it up with research and with data. So thank you very much for that. So look, we do have a little bit of time to for some discussions, and as you would have noticed that whatever you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself and share your ideas and questions and comments with Joe and everybody else, or just type it in the chat.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry, it's hard to see the chat while you're screen sharing, so I haven't looked at all of them.
There's quite a lot of comments, but generally comments rather than questions. I'm not sure if Sally had a question. She just
I had to change my shirt because I'm in a Friday afternoon shirt. But anyway, it's a little bit better. Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you, Pranit, and thank you so much for repeating this. It's been so valuable. Look, I'm coming at it again from first year, so I'm scared by all the great work that you do. I just can't keep up with Cradle and then all your international colleagues. But then someone forced me to rethink about first year assessment. And my question is around that, particularly from the programmatic lens. And I sort of had a bit of a dabble in there. And thank you also for saying that developing assessment and feedback literacies goes towards assessment for inclusion. I found that really helpful. So imagine if we had a programmatic approach to assessment that seriously considered the role of first year in assessment for inclusion. What would that look like? I suspect the answer might be it's all ungraded. I suspect the emphasis might be on for and as assessment rather than of assessment. And we can build those. So what do you think about that, clever Professor Tai?
Oh, that would be cool. I think, yeah, considering like thinking about that bigger picture, I think is really important for the purposes of inclusion. Because, well, and when I've talked to these individual students in the research projects, I've really discovered the great variety of prior to getting into university experiences. And some people have like great, they might be mature age students who already work in a company and are doing the degree because their company wants to support them to do better. But yet, they haven't studied for 10, 15 years, and the conventions of university are just bizarre. Like that's, and so to be inclusive for those students who may or may not fall into a formal equity group, it makes me really consider the way that we expect particular things of students when they come into university. Like you kind of just throw them all in and say, this is the way we do things. But actually we should be doing a lot more explicit scaffolding. And I think a lot of great first year courses already do quite a bit of this, about normalizing the need to seek help, about normalizing, like introducing the formats of the assignment even, and clarifying all of that. But yeah, this idea of assessment and feedback literacy also comes to the point of inclusion. I think now the pass grade only bit, students also really like to know how they're going, and I think that's the main tension about how do we satisfy their needs for definitely knowing exactly how well they've done, and perhaps things like the VCE here or the ATAR sort of train students into thinking that we can very finely tell them exactly how they're going. But what is the difference between a 69 and a 70? Like other research would suggest that we make kind of holistic judgments about how students are going rather than being able to finally put a pinpoint and rank them in order. So yeah, I think we need to think harder about what that looks like. And also, I know Dave always talks about the systems that prevent us from doing these things, in that the system wants a number to be passed through so that the other system can record it somewhere and add it up. Like, so how we can change those things so that the first year experience could look different. I mean, that's, yeah.
So I'll stop now, but I've just put in the chat a great piece from Elizabeth Ansman from UNS, from your UNSW, Pranit.
Yeah, no, that was so impressive.
That's so impressive, you know, and that makes you think. So it's not perhaps not ungrading for everything in all circumstances in first year, but for these critical competencies that they need as foundational to later years. No, but thank you very much. That's very helpful.
And you know, it is all meant to be standards based, right? So as long as they meet the standard, that's what they need to get to the next level. Like that's, yeah. So yeah.
And I think if you could look at the comment from Daniela in the chat at the moment, so it's not like it's not being done elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So there are obviously.
And the opportunity to resubmit as well. I'm not sure, Daniela. I can't remember exactly which country I was in, but I know I've had colleagues from elsewhere in the world say, look, you know, if you don't pass the first time, you have the opportunity, you get told why it wasn't good enough. And yeah, you just resubmit until you don't pass the course until you finally get the resubmit, but you do get that opportunity, and that is also about, you know, making use of feedback. So yeah. We don't know what is different. We don't know outside what's our normal until somebody else tells us that actually you can do this other thing, right? So value that diversity.
And there's a comment from Amita. I wonder what implication it had for academics marking workload. Yeah.
So here, I really need to catch up with Andrew Kane, who has a similar system called On Track, and he uses it in his computer science, but I think it's also been spread across engineering and maths around students figure out what level of achievement they want, and then they do the tasks to get to that level, and they get feedback, they submit, and they get feedback. If it's not good enough, they have to submit again. And that is something that they're doing. So the workload obviously has to look different, and it still has to be manageable and sustainable. And I think there are broader concerns and issues around workload that is that exists outside of discussions on inclusion that we need to think about. And I know colleagues have also pointed out that when we're talking about inclusion and well-being, we've talked mainly about students and we haven't talked about staff, and that's maybe another thing that we need to get onto.
Look, we're probably running out of time. I'm pretty sure we can entertain one more question or comment if anybody has that. Well, we might wrap it up in that case. Look, on that note, actually, Joe, thank you again so much for a wonderful afternoon talking about inclusive assessment. And I really liked your comment towards the end about an inclusive assessment will challenge validity, right? So I think to me that is a very important takeaway kind of thing. So it's not only is it important because we're doing the right thing, but it actually challenges validity. So thank you very much for that. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording now.